It's a great pleasure to be here in Kilkenny, and particularly in Rose House, which must be one of the nicest venues for any archaeological society, not only in Ireland, but I'd say worldwide, to come and talk. Tonight I'll be talking about the excavations that were carried out on the New Ross bypass in South Kilkenny and Wexford. And you'll be glad to know I'm not going to talk about every one of the 36 sites that were excavated, but I'm going to focus on a few of the key sites and use them to give you, I suppose, an insight into how a development project like the New Ross bypass, which was obviously much needed infrastructure, has contributed to our archaeological knowledge of Kilkenny and the wider southeast. The introductory slide there is probably a view that Kilkenny people wouldn't be used to of South Kilkenny and Brandon Hill from just above, if you know, Faithleg Hotel, Cheek Point in County Waterford. So looking northwards up the Barrow Valley, or along this stretch, what in the medieval times and even still local fishermen called the River of Ross. So the estuarine portion of the River Barrow is known locally as the River of Ross, and that crops up in various historical documentation. And you can just see there, this is the big bridge, the Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy Bridge, under construction. So this was back about 7 years ago, and that's the big high pier in the middle. So tonight it's my great pleasure to follow in the footsteps of two distinguished predecessors who spoke to this society about significant archaeological discoveries in the part of Kilkenny that borders the tidal portion of the River Barrow and the adjacent part of Wexford. 127 years ago, on the 2nd of May 1849, the second meeting of the Kilkenny Archaeological Society heard a report from Reverend Philip Moore of his discovery of a hitherto unnoticed cromlech at Glen Clochley, southwest of New Ross. Sorry, I dived straight in without acknowledging the various people that have contributed to tonight's talk that you can see here. In particular, the work of archaeologists is greatly facilitated by the landowners, who are often the very first people that they meet whenever a new road starts to be constructed. And they're often the very first people that they meet when a new road is planned, and they're unfailingly courteous to us and facilitate our work greatly. So here we are, as I say, the New Ross bypass. Here you have a map of Waterford Harbour and the River Barrow, and you have here New Ross, and the red line indicates the line of the bypass. This is the 19th century map. And here on the Valentine Gill Grand Jury map of County Wexford, the route, obviously the Grand Jury of County Wexford only mapped County Wexford. They omitted the adjacent parts of Kilkenny, apart from, interesting enough, Anna's Castle, the seat of Edward Murphy, and Rossberkin, of course. The nice thing about the Valentine Gill map is that it gives you a sense of the topography that the bypass route passes through. And here again is another view, I suppose a long distance view, this time from Slieve Caillte, which is the large hill. Any of you that know the John F. Kennedy Arboretum, if you go to the car park on the top of the hill there, this is the magnificent view you get looking northwards up the Barrow Valley. And this then is a detailed plan of the bypass route, showing the location of the 36 different sites that were excavated along it. And these then are the sites that my talk tonight will mostly be focusing on. So you can see I'm just taking a selection of the 36 sites that were excavated. But anyway, back to Reverend Philip Moore, who was a Catholic curate in Rossberkin in the late 1840s, of course, famine times, so a time of great distress in the countryside, but it didn't stop his antiquarian interests, and indeed was a distinguished member of this society, and also one of the founding members, and also a leading member of the Ossory Archaeological Society based in St. Kieran's College, and so on. As curate in Rossberkin, he came across, or was probably informed about this megalithic tomb, which we now know is a portal tomb dating from the early Neolithic period. So the period around, the latest research in terms of radiocarbon dating of human remains from these types of tombs indicates that they were constructed and used in the period around 3600 to 3800 BC. 5 years later then, at another meeting of this society in November 1854, the 24-year-old John Henry Glascott, a graduate of Trinity College Dublin and scion of a wealthy Wexford landowning family, travelled to Kilkenny from the family seat at Killowen House, 9 kilometres downstream from New Ross, to attend another meeting here in Kilkenny. At the meeting, he brought with him and displayed sherds of 2 decorated pottery vessels and some cremated bone, and reported to the members present that they had been found the previous summer on his father's land, about 6 feet below the surface of the field, by workmen quarrying a natural sandbank near the River Barrow at Dunganstown. Sadly, neither the pottery nor the cremated bone were preserved. However, from Glascott's detailed description, Dr. Rhoda Kavanagh was able to classify his crocks, as he described them, as the remains of 2 early Bronze Age encrusted urns around 4,000 years old. And based on property records and so on, and also historic mapping, it seems likely that this is the field adjacent to the River Barrow, just on its eastern bank, where that small cemetery, that early Bronze Age cemetery, was found in the early 1850s. And Killowen House, which was the family seat of the Glascotts, is located in the woodland a little bit downstream there. Most famously recently has been the residence of Michael Ryan. Any of you who remember the RT journalist Michael Ryan, that was where it's where he still lives, I believe. So it was the dedication of antiquarians like Reverend Moore and the serendipity of individuals like John Henry Glascott learning about the chance discoveries of archaeological objects and monuments that provided the main source of data for researchers seeking to understand the archaeology of South East Ireland between the 1830s and the 1980s. However, the types of monuments recognised by antiquarians were generally restricted to those with substantial upstanding remains, like Reverend Moore's cromlech, and the range of archaeological finds recorded was mostly limited to stone and metal finds, or stone and metal tools, weapons and ornaments, and pottery from early Bronze Age burials. Nonetheless, their endeavours provided the data which enabled subsequent generations of archaeological researchers to synthesise aspects of the region's archaeological heritage. This fed in then in the 1980s to the establishment by the Archaeological Survey of Ireland of the Sites and Monuments Record, to systematically compile a catalogue with accompanying maps of all known archaeological remains and find spots which could be identified from documentary records and publications, historical cartographic sources, aerial photographs, and the reports of archaeological research and excavation. The Sites and Monuments Record then formed the basis for the statutory record of monuments and places. And I mentioned these statutory structures or these administrative tools because when it comes to state investment in infrastructure and indeed other types of development, it's always been recognised that these types of developments have the potential to impact archaeological remains, and the managers and the administrators responsible for these projects were aware that the unexpected discovery of significant archaeological remains during the construction phase could have serious implications for the programme of construction and also on the public purse. And for this audience, I probably just need to say 4 words: Kilkenny Flood Relief Scheme. With this in mind, the National Roads Authority, the NRA as used to be, and the National Monuments Service agreed a code of practice for the management of archaeology on national roads projects in 2000, which led to the creation of NRA-funded project archaeologist positions in National Road regional design offices around the country. Happily for me, this resulted in my appointment in March 2001, 25 years ago, last week, remarkably, as project archaeologist based in the Regional Design Office for the South East, which is in Tramore. The Tramore office manages the design, development and maintenance of national roads in Kilkenny, Waterford and Wexford. And before they were reunited, we used to deal with South Tipperary as well. But Tip has gone rogue, so we don't deal with them anymore. And we work in partnership with the relevant local authorities. And the Regional Design Office, the National Road Regional Design Office is mostly, as you'd imagine, engineers, but there's 2 archaeologists based in the Tramore office. So in 2001, the N25 New Ross bypass was one of the first projects I was assigned to. The need for the bypass of the town was clear. Those of you, I'm sure, remember many long hours sitting in traffic, either coming in from the west side, or any of you who were waiting across the Hannon Bridge, or indeed coming in from the east side as well. Of course, William Marshall, back in the 13th century, recognised the strategic importance of a bridge at New Ross for trade and transport between Wexford, Kilkenny and the adjoining regions. However, in modern times, the latest bridge, O'Hanlon Bridge, had become a major bottleneck on the N25, with tailbacks sometimes extending for several kilometres either side of the town, with consequent negative environmental, economic, and you might say heritage impacts as well in terms of the urban heritage of New Ross. So the bypass itself, the bypass of New Ross is 14 kilometres long. It extends from Jamestown in the west across the River Barrow to Rathgarogue on the N30 northeast, 7 kilometres northeast of New Ross. The bypass route crosses through 16 townlands, 4 in Kilkenny and 12 in Wexford. And the most notable feature of the bypass is, of course, the 900-metre long Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy Bridge, the longest bridge on the island of Ireland, constructed where the route crosses the River Barrow between Pinkrock in Kilkenny and Stokestown in Wexford. And so I mentioned already the Sites and Monuments Record and the Record of Monuments and Places, and this code of practice that was agreed by the National Roads Authority with the National Monument Service. And basically the appointment of myself and other colleagues around the country ushered in a more strategic approach to managing the archaeological evaluation of road schemes in Ireland, both in the design phase and then also in the phase leading up to construction and during construction. And basically, it can be summed up in, I suppose, a couple of ways. At the design phase, the objective is to avoid impacting on known archaeological and historic monuments. And this is something that we're thankfully able to do by working closely with our engineering colleagues to design routes and alignments that avoid significant cultural and heritage impacts. Then, when the roads gets approved by now on Comisiún Pleanála, we have a very structured approach to archaeological assessment. And what we do in terms of archaeological assessment is the sort of work that you see up here on the left. Sinead Marshall may well be somewhere in that photograph. This was the initial test excavation phase on the New Ross bypass, where, as you can see, we have large tract excavators digging these linear test trenches through the landscape. And our objective is to sample 12% of the greenfield or the previously undeveloped land acquired for road construction. And we've discovered through trial and error that, that needs the identification of, all the major archaeological sites that haven't been identified through other techniques previously. So on New Ross bypass, in practical terms, we had 2 phases of test excavation in 2010 and 2013. The New Ross bypass was one of those projects which suffered from or was victim of our economic crash and the advent of the Troika, because literally work was suspended in 2010 when we were partway through the test excavations, and then we had to come back 3 years later. In total, more than 2,000 test trenches were excavated, an aggregate length of over 100 kilometres. And in total, on the New Ross bypass, we actually tested almost 16% of the land acquired for construction. There was 117 hectares of land in total acquired for construction. So you can see here the test excavation phase. The photograph in the top right then shows a feature. In this case, I hope you can see this darker patch of soil, and an archaeologist carefully cleaning back the area to fully expose and to check if it's, an isolated feature, if it's associated with something else, part of a bigger archaeological complex. And if it is found that I hope can everybody see the darker area that I'm pointing at there, yeah? So if that is found to be part of a more extensive complex, we then open up, and in this case I say the royal we, it's people like Sinead do the hard work. I whiz in and whiz out and manage things. But then we open up a wider area around where the remains are identified in the test trenching. And then, as you can see, getting a team of archaeologists to very carefully and painstakingly clean back and excavate any remains that might survive in that area. So I suppose that's the background to, why we do what we do, and also how we find the archaeology on a big road scheme like the New Ross bypass. So, I'm going to focus on a few different sites, but 3 different topics in tonight's talk. So the first one is the first farmers. So I suppose this is take my cue from the title of the book, Place for the Living. This is Places for the Living, Traces of the First Farmers. Ryleen, on an elevated tract of fertile land on the lower southwest-facing slopes of Lacken Hill, which is this hill here, which was the site of an encampment in 1798. Any of you who are interested in the history of 1798, there's a memorial stone and a cross on the summit of the hill there, a nice walk. So it's on the southwest slopes of Lacken Hill, with wide views over the landscape and sloping down to the Magdalen Stream, a small watercourse which is a tributary of the River Barrow. Archaeologists from Rubicon Archaeology, during the test excavations, found traces of archaeological features which, when they were excavated, turned out to be the remains of a house, and based on the morphology of the remains and also the associated pottery and lithic tools, dated to the early Neolithic period. So the people who lived in this house were the part of a community. While they may not have built the portal tomb that Reverend Moore identified in Glencloughley, they were certainly contemporaries of the people who built that monument. Obviously, this is on the opposite side of the River Barrow, so it's probably a stretch to think that they were building monuments on the other side of the Barrow. But we don't know, because we don't know sufficient as of yet about the structure of early Neolithic settlement in the Barrow Valley. But anyway, the house here survived only as foundation trenches in the ground, because obviously the house was built of organic materials, wood and clay and thatch and so on, which had long ago decayed. It was 8.5 metres long, and the foundation trench that you can see there measured between 30 centimetres at its narrowest, 50 centimetres at its narrowest, and up to 1.5 metres at its widest, and was up to 75 centimetres deep. It defined an internal area of 35 square metres. There was an entrance located on the northwest end here. There were internal divisions. So the building was divided into 2 rooms. In terms then of the foundations, there was particular concentrations of stones associated with the 4 corners, particularly, as you can see here, the northeast corner, very extensive and substantial foundations. They, in places, seem to have been associated with plank walling. So here at the southwest corner, just where the pointer is, you can see there's a series of what you might call kind of rectangular slots in the base of the foundation trench. And they seem literally to have been the ends, where the ends of oak planks were standing vertically. Elsewhere, the narrowness of the gap between the packing stones and the edge of the trench suggests that the walls in other parts of the building may have been made of wattle. And that's a pattern that's observed in other Neolithic houses in Ireland. And it may well be that the emphasis on the facade here was to have an imposing facade. So you'd use oak planks to make your house look that bit more substantial, whereas kind of around the back, you just use wattle and plaster it with daub or just leave it exposed. Inside the house then, there were a series, and you can see these lines drawn on the plan, define a series of deposits, floor deposits. So this is a very interesting and quite a rare survival in terms of Irish Neolithic houses, because often, as you can saw in the first photograph, this was an area of tillage. So this had been ploughed for many generations, you'd expect. But there were traces of trampled deposits in the floor of the building here, into which charcoal and bone and some stone tools and crumbs of pottery and so on had been pressed because of repeated walking and activity within the house. You can also see there are a number of pits, and some of these seem to be contemporary with the use of the house, but others may have been after the house had gone out of use. So what did this look like? I suppose looking at a plan, it's hard to visualize what the structure would have looked like. So here we have a couple of different visualizations. This cutaway version by Sarah Nyland from Rubicon gives a sense of kind of the house and activity that might have taken place around it. Hannah Sims, also Rubicon Archaeology, created this internal view, and you can see how the internal space then might have been divided up by that internal wall, and also the internal post holes seem substantial enough to have potentially held, an upper, well, not quite an upper story, but at least, a loft or something similar. And indeed, in the Irish National Heritage Park in Ferrycarrig in Wexford, they have a reconstruction of a Neolithic house, and that gives you a good sense of the variety of materials, but also how the space could have been divided up. And so you see here, they've actually, the people that built this house actually visited another Neolithic house that was found near Enniscorthy, and they incorporated some of the results of that excavation into their reconstruction. So you can see here they have a kind of a loft, they have internal wicker screens. In this case, you can't really see it, but again, they've got oak planking flanking the doorway, but then the other walls are wicker covered with daub. And then the material that was found associated with the house, the classic early Neolithic artifact is the stone axe. This was the tool, the multi-purpose tool that the early farming communities used to clear the land, to cut down the forests. It's the sort of activity that we have direct evidence for in Kilkenny from a pollen core from Lough Cullen, which is near Mulnavat, between Mulnavat and Slieve. And the palynologists have literally taken a core from the bed of the lake, and there they can measure the varying proportions of different types of pollen through time. And at the beginning of the Neolithic, you can see how there's a major decline in tree pollen and not a consequential rise, but a simultaneous rise in herb pollen, but also indicators or pollen from cereals. So the stone axe was a vital tool, not only for that clearance, but also for the carpentry work that would have gone into building the house and so on. And this is an example of a mudstone axe that turned up actually in South Kilkenny, a place called Ballygorry, near Mooncoin, about 15 years ago, and it was deposited in the Waterford Treasures Museum. And here you can see a selection of stone tools that the people who lived in this house in Ryleen used: scrapers, knives, blades, and small little leaf-shaped arrowhead up here, and then a nice rock crystal, what appears to be used as a projectile point, so another kind of arrowhead. Obviously you can see the difference in scales there. That's a 5 centimetre scale here, this is just 2 centimetres, so this is a tiny little object altogether. The other thing, of course, that distinguished the early Neolithic not only was the coming of agriculture, the commencement of agriculture in Ireland and in the New Ross area, along with the stone axes and the distinctive stone tools, the big innovation in the Neolithic period was the use of pottery. And early Neolithic pottery is a very distinctive form that we as archaeologists call carinated bowls. So basically it's a bowl that has an angle at the shoulder. So if you imagine your cereal bowl, and you can see it here in the reconstruction drawing, or the reconstructed pot, again, thanks to the Irish National Heritage Park. You have the rim here, and then it goes down quite vertically, and then there's this distinctive angle. This is the carination, and then the base is hemispherical. So if you hear archaeologists talking about a carinated bowl, that's what a carinated bowl should look like. What we as archaeologists find are sherds. It's very rare to find a complete vessel, certainly from the early Neolithic. But you can see here the variety of different rim forms, and the photographs give you a sense of the pottery. And what's amazing is, again, in the last 2 decades, traditionally pottery was just seen as being of use to archaeologists because it was a cultural marker and a chronological marker as well, if you got a typologically distinct type of pottery. But with the advent of advances in molecular biology and molecular science and so on, colleagues can now take samples from these sherds of pottery from the interior of these vessels, and they can examine the lipids, the fats that have been absorbed into the pottery, because this is just earthenware. It's not fired at a very high temperature, so it's still porous. And from looking at the molecules that are trapped or become embedded in the pottery, even though it's, almost 6,000 years old, the molecules survive. And researchers like Jessica Smith, who's based in University College Dublin, have been able to conclude that the majority of Irish early Neolithic pottery was associated with the processing of dairy products, milk. So, probably, milk, but also potentially cheeses, yogurts, other ways of preserving, the produce from the dairy herds that would have grazed in the fields that they had cleared that they would have created by clearing the forests. So this is a very exciting. Now, unfortunately, none of the pottery from Ryleen could be included or has been analysed, so we don't know for a fact that the Ryleen pottery held milk, but based on the comparative research, it's highly likely that it did. So these were some of the first dairy farmers in the southeast. So proto-Glanbia, or whatever Glanbia is now called. So, from places of the living to places of the dead, Bronze Age, as we've already heard from John Henry Glascott, the Bronze Age is associated with burials. And one of the very significant, there were a number of significant Bronze Age burial sites found on the bypass. And I suppose traditionally, along with burials, the Bronze Age in Ireland has been associated with monuments like the Three Friars Stone Row in Smithstown, just east of Mulnavat. This is a halberd from the very end of the Copper Age, beginning of the Bronze Age, which was in Redmond Anthony's museum in Piltown. It was found in the 1830s and purchased by Redmond Anthony and displayed in his museum in Piltown, but was found actually in Anshleva, that prominent hill southeast of New Ross, where I took the photograph, the landscape photograph from that I showed you earlier. This then, a standing stone. Again, standing stones can date from any period, but many standing stones for which we have dating evidence for have been found to be from the Bronze Age, and they're sometimes associated with burial as well as being territorial markers. And of course then we have a huge wealth in Ireland of gold finds, particularly from the latter half of the Bronze Age. And this is an example of a late Bronze Age hoard, known as the New Ross hoard. But in fact, its fine circumstances are shrouded in mystery. It was acquired by Henry Goff Davis, who was a bit of an industrialist in Waterford in the late 19th and early 20th century, a rabid unionist and obviously wealthy. A jeweller in Waterford acquired this hoard, reportedly found in the bed of a stream near New Ross, County Waterford. So who knows? I suspect, given that that stretch of the River Barrow, the estuarine stretch, is known as the River of Ross, it was probably a stream draining into that section of the Barrow. But we actually don't know, and obviously, no stream in County Waterford drains into the River of Ross, so it's more likely to be a find from either South Kilkenny or Wexford. But highly unusual to have a hoard from a stream as well, so it's all a bit dubious. But anyway, thankfully, Henry Goff Davis, in his munificence, bought it and donated it to the National Collections, where it survives. So I opened with John Henry Glascott's presentation of his crocks at a meet at the Kilkenny Archaeological Society in 1854. Well, here's my version of John Henry Glascott. Here's my crocks from a site at Stokestown. And what's this is about 1.4 kilometres north of that field that I showed you the photograph of. And lo and behold, Mandy Stevens, who excavated this site, found an encrusted urn, just the exact same type of pottery that John Henry Glascott's, his father's workmen, found in Dunganstown. So this encrusted urn, as you can see, all that survived was the lower part that had been placed in the ground, inverted in an inverted position, so the mouth and the neck of the vessel survives. The rest of it had been removed as a result of ploughing over the centuries. It was protected in this stone-lined cist with a very substantial floor stone, and nicely, what I'm not sure if you can see here, but you can actually see the fingerprints of the potter in the clay of the pot. So it's a find that kind of brings you, in a way, kind of very close to the Bronze Age people that would have made and used this vessel. There was a total of 4 burials found at this site, but only 2 of them were associated with pottery vessels, and the other one was this less fine vessel, a bipartite vessel, but decorated with incised lozenge motifs. The line drawing gives you a better sense of the decoration or the decorative schema on the encrusted urn. And so the encrusted urn was associated with the remains of an adult male. The other 3 burials, including the burial, the cremation with this pot, couldn't be identified to sex, but they all appear to have been adults. So this was the last resting place of 4 Bronze Age adults from the period around 1800 to 1900 BC. At Camlin 3 then, so further east along the bypass, during test excavations, this large boulder was encountered which didn't project above the level of the ground in modern times, but may well have projected above the level of the ground originally. So it was on a slope. So you can imagine over the centuries and millennia, soil gravity causes soil erosion and hill wash and so on. And beside that boulder, about 1.5 meters away from it, there was the very truncated remains of a single urn burial. In this case, it was an interesting discovery because it had been, the base of the vessel had been removed or damaged as a result of ploughing. But interestingly, the vessel had been broken when it was used as a burial vessel. So it was never, it was obviously once complete when it was manufactured or made, but the people who buried, and in this case it was another male, aged between about 35 and 40, Carmelita Troy, the osteoarchaeologist, was able to discern that there was evidence for some damage to his vertebrae suggesting, a life of hard work and labour, unsurprisingly. But the people that buried him or buried his remains, for whatever reason, didn't have access to a full pot, so they just used half a pot to contain his remains, doing it on the cheap maybe. But I suppose it does just show you the diversity in terms of early Bronze Age burial practice as well, and how people were adaptable and could change their approach as the need arose. The other interesting thing about the boulder here is, of course, that this is on what you might call a natural routeway up from the River Barrow and across kind of into inland areas. So it may well be that this was a landmark or a local landmark, and that the burial was placed close by it. Further up the hill then in Camlin, so at a higher altitude, we've made a much more, from an archaeological perspective, a much more interesting discovery and a much more significant discovery. And so the next couple of minutes I'll talk about this site, Camlin 4, and also another site called Berkeley 3. And these are 2 Middle Bronze Age cemetery sites. And what you can see here is this spread of material and a whole series of these little pits dug into it. And the photograph there gives you a sense of what the site looked like. And these pits, quite a number of them, contained human cremated bone. Again, all the burials we have from the Bronze Age are cremated on this project. And the photograph here in the bottom right shows you one of these pits, and you'll probably have to take my word for it, but you can just see there's some fragments of cremated bone visible on the surface of the pit. So Middle Bronze Age burials and cemeteries are not as common as early Bronze Age cemeteries, and this is because they generally don't contain pottery vessels, and so they weren't recognised, or they couldn't be identified by non-archaeologists effectively because they don't contain the nice vases or crocks, as John Henry Glascott would have it. So this site at Camlin 4 was identified as a result of the test excavations. There was no above ground evidence for it, The spread here isn't a mound as such, but it's only about 20 centimetres thick at its thickest. So it's just a spread of soil. And what's very significant about Camlin 4 and Berkeley 3 is that we have stratigraphic relationships. So archaeologists, in terms of interpreting activity at site, when you have superimposed layers or intercutting features, it gives us a much better insight into the use history of a site. So in this case, at Camlin 4, the first phase comprised 2 pits containing human remains, which were then subsequently sealed by this spread of soil, which was 10 metres in its maximum dimensions. And then after that spread of soil had been placed covering 2 of the 2 earlier pits, a series of 8 further pits were dug into the surface of that deposit. And unlike the Stokestown cemetery, there was no fine pottery. There was 1 pot, which you can see the conservator Susanna Kelly here preparing to lift, and it's a courseware vessel, so undecorated. And 2 of the burials contained these very ugly stone beads, or perforated pieces of slate, really. You wouldn't necessarily call them beads, but they were clearly worked. Fascinatingly, at Berkeley 3, we had a very similar sequence. And here, the phase plan gives you a sense. So these were the initial series of features. Again, 2 pits containing a human bone, also a line of post holes, and this gully. So it may be that this was associated with some form of a boundary feature marked or indicated by the post holes and this gully. Those features were then covered by this, again, a kidney-shaped mound in this case, similar dimensions to the spread at Camlin 4, and then 17 pits dug into the surface of that deposit, 7 of which contained human cremated bones. And there you get a sense of, this is 2 adjacent pits, and here's Niamh Carty, the Austrian archaeologist, carefully excavating some of the human remains from this site. So again, so this is 2 sites about 9 kilometres apart, but on the same scheme, and showing an almost identical sequence of activity, which is very significant. And what's of greater significance, because we had that stratigraphic sequence, we were able to obtain samples for radiocarbon dating from the earlier phase of burial and from the later phase of burial. Ben Spillane, who's a researcher now based in UCD, was able to do some advanced chronological modelling. He was able to discern, so this is at Camlin 4, that the first phase, based on the radiocarbon dating, probably took place, over a space of maybe 30 years. The spread of soil was then superimposed, and about 41 years later, or up to 41 years, probably 41 years later, the second phase of activity took place. So Ben, this has been ongoing research, and in fact he's received funding from the Royal Academy to do more, to take more samples and so on. And so the sequence of activities at these 2 sites is becoming more refined as a result of his research. And it's giving us a much better insight into the sequence of burial at these 2 sites. And that has implications for our understanding of Middle Bronze Age burial across the whole island of Ireland. Because in most cases, the Middle Bronze Age cemeteries, when they're found, they're just a mass of pits, and you don't have this sequence, such a clear sequence. So I might just go back there to this slide, and I suppose it just shows you the difference between the sort of typical early Bronze Age burials. So again, this is another encrusted urn from a site in County Carlow, and so this is the sort of thing that the Glascott workmen would have found. Early Bronze Age burials are often found in very substantial cysts, like this example containing a crouched inhumation. But then, as I say, the Middle Bronze Age burial tradition is much less impressive, and it's only through projects like the bypass investigations that we get to identify these types of sites. And then equally, the pottery, as you can see, is much less impressive. And, again, in terms of antiquarians, they would have looked at something like that and they wouldn't have recognised it as being of great antiquity. So back to the living and moving from the prehistoric era into the historic era. So obviously the late medieval or Anglo-Norman period is associated with many highly visible and high status sites in the landscape. Here you have the Mott and Bailey at Old Ross, which I won't dwell on because Sinead knows far more about it than I will ever. This is a very nice tower house in Anna's, just on the Kilkenny side of the River Barrow, south downstream from New Ross. Then figurative sculpture and decorative mouldings from the south transept of St Mary's Parish Church in New Ross, 13th century. So again, here you're looking at the period of Strongbow and Earl Marshall and Isabella. Indeed, Isabella is reputed to have founded the St Mary's in New Ross, and indeed I think it was actually Augustinians from Kilkenny were assigned to it. It was when New Ross was obviously part of the lordship of Leinster and so on. Anyway, we didn't find any of that on the bypass, thankfully, and we made sure to avoid it all. But most significantly, what we did find was this site in a townland that is now called Landscape, but that name is actually a later name applied to a subdivision of what would have been a bigger townland of Stokestown. So this is just on the Wexford bank of the Barrow. This townland of, as I say, what is now Landscape, it was formerly Stokestown, would have been on the outermost kind of southwestern periphery of the manor of Old Ross. In the medieval period, so in the 13th, 14th century, it would have been located right on the western limits of the manor, beside the estuarine wetlands of the Barrow. And this is the remains of a farmstead, an undefended farmstead, and it comprises a boundary ditch along its northern side, and then a series of boundary ditches along the southeast and west sides, and a series of structures or buildings, or the remains of structures or buildings internally. So in overall length east-west, it was just under 40 metres from here to here. And it contained evidence for five different buildings, which all appear to have been contemporary. So these weren't a sequence buildings, this was built as one unitary structure, and appears to have been all occupied at the same time based on the evidence from the pottery that was found. And again, based on the pottery, Claire McCutcheon, who's the national expert in medieval pottery, who looked at the pottery assemblage, concluded that it's a site that its origins are in the 13th century and was probably occupied into the 14th century. Radiocarbon dating suggests that it might have a slightly longer occupation phase continuing to the 15th century, but I'm not so convinced by that. The buildings comprised dwelling and what appears to have been a barn, and then a series of kind of other smaller lean-to buildings. And you get a sense of it here on the plan. So again, this is the dwelling here, this is the barn here. You can see this structure here, another structure here, and then another structure out here, and also a small little annex here. And you can see this is the southern enclosure ditch, and this is the northern enclosure ditch. And just on the outside of the northern enclosure ditch, there were some patches of cobbling, which seems to be a roadway. I'll just focus, I won't go through all the details, but I'll focus on the cottage or the dwelling and the barn. And so the cottage appears to be what's known as a byre house. So at the west end here, you have the living space, and at the east end here, you have a space for animals. And these are a type of building that are well attested in England and on the continent. And even in terms of the Irish vernacular tradition, there were byre houses like this occupied up until the 19th century, and they were particularly associated with bullying in upland areas at that stage. But here we're clearly not in a bullying situation. This is good land in the southeast. So this is probably a fairly typical type dwelling, peasant dwelling from the 13th century. And it's an unusual find because, again, the walls of these buildings would have been built of mud, mostly, with some, you can see here, 2 post holes and there are other post holes internally. So, the structure would have been earth and timber and thatch, a bit like the Neolithic house, nothing that would have survived more than 2 or 3 generations. As I say, the dwelling part of the house was at the western end, and you can see there are 2 hearths. So there seems to have been a sequence of hearths. The possible entrance is defined by this pair of post holes in the north side facing out towards the roadway. And then the animals, or the byre part, is at the eastern end, and there's a drain, a lintel drain, which is running out to the ditch. So again, this would have taken the animal waste. And there's seems to have been a doorway between the 2 different parts of the house. The barn then, which stood across the yard effectively from the house and at right angles to it, was a larger building. It was 6 metres long and 3 metres wide. There's 4 post holes at the southern end, which suggest again that it might have had some sort of a loft type structure. And these 3 substantial post holes in the western wall suggest the location of the doorway. So, and there you have an aerial view of it taken from the south. There was a small annex built onto one end, which may have been used for animals. Jonathan Miller, based on the excavated evidence, has created this visualisation of how the settlement would have looked. And what always strikes me when I see this is that it doesn't look all that dissimilar to a vernacular farm complex that you would still see in the Irish countryside. And so I suppose what this gives us a sense of is that these type of structures that we see in our contemporary landscape, they weren't obviously built in the 13th or 14th century, but the way of living, I suppose, represented by this complex of buildings persisted into the 19th and 20th century. What changed, of course, is that the people who lived here were tenants of the Lord of the Manor of Ross. They would have paid render, probably food render, to the manor. They were the lowest social order. In terms of who the people were, there's hints in the historic records. Settlements like this are difficult to find archaeologically, and they're also not described in historical documentation. Even though we're in a historical period, these types of settlements do not get described by, the chroniclers or by the people responsible for drawing up the inventories of the Lord's possessions and so on. Because these are just, for the Lord, these are economic units. These people live and they produce food and they pay that food in render to the Lord. So it's very significant to find this settlement like this. What is interesting is that there are hints, as I was saying, in the historical records from the 15th century that this area was known as Ballycraigie. Margaret Murphy, who's a noted historian of the period, has concluded, based on the evidence, documentary evidence, that this part of the manor of New Ross was associated with livestock rearing. And indeed, there are references in the manorial accounts. So, for instance, the minister's accounts from the manor of Old Ross in 1288 record income from the right of pannage, which would have been the grazing of swine in the woods. And historically, this area adjacent to landscape was known as the Forest of Ross. The minister's accounts for the manor of Old Ross also contain a wealth of data relating to the production of wool on the manor. So again, the people who lived here may well have been involved in producing wool and raising other livestock. The material culture then from the site comprises a variety of different types of pottery, all locally made, Leinster cookingware, but also Wexford type wares. But interestingly, there's a variety of storage jars. These are actually bungholes from a kind of so these would have been from jars that would have held liquids, and this would have been like a spout at the base of the vessel that would have had a stopper in it. These 2 objects here are clay lamps, and the people who lived here, while they may have been the lowest social order, the retrieval of this barrel padlock key suggests that they had some belongings that were worth locking up in a chest. And this illustration by Hannah Sims gives you an indication of the range of different pottery and other material culture that they would have had here. So you can see the range of different types of pottery vessels: jugs, storage, jars, platters, and also their clay lamps. So to finish off, I was just going to, I suppose, reflect a little bit. This is a shot of the landscape looking up the hill at Camlin. So this is the field in which the landscape late medieval settlement was found. Up here, the single, obviously this was before the bypass was built, the single burial beside the boulder was found in this field here. Higher up the hill, the Middle Bronze Age cemetery at Camlin 4 was found. So I suppose it just indicates, and there are a wealth of other sites. You can see here Camlin was a focus of a number of different sites from different periods. So it emphasises that in any stretch of landscape like this, you can have a variety of sites in terms of form and function and date, all in close proximity. And the reasons why we find that clusters of sites along linear development projects like roads is that, if the conditions are right for settlement in the Neolithic period, chances are those conditions will also attract a settlement in later periods, and so on. What is interesting, though, is, for instance, when you look at the Middle Bronze Age cemeteries at, in this case, Camlin and the other site here at Berkeley, they are, relatively speaking, in elevated locations in the landscape. And again, if we look back at the pollen core from Lough Cullen near Mulnavat, we can see that a bit like in the Neolithic period, the Middle Bronze Age was a period when there was a very significant expansion of agriculture, which resulted in significant environmental impacts, which was undoubtedly associated with new parts of the landscape being cleared of woodland and forestry. So there's, you might say, a second clearance in the Middle Bronze Age. And so it may well be that the reason why the Camlin Middle Bronze Age cemetery and the Berkeley Middle Bronze Age cemetery on slightly more elevated areas of land is that these were areas that were recently cleared. And so, the ancestors were being used to lay claim to these newly cleared areas of land. What is interesting is that the early Bronze Age burials are very much seem to be focused on, let's say, the river. So you have the Stokestown burial here, the Dunganstown burial down here, the Camlin burial beside the boulder was on the lower slopes of Camlin Hill, overlooking a stream as well. So they may be more to do with defining a territory rather than claiming a territory, you might say. Roads, however, are not, while they're, from an archaeological perspective, kind of random slice through the landscape, they're not totally random, because obviously road designers and engineers want to find a route that's level, that isn't too twisty, and so on. And so as a result, and here just looking at the altitude of the land acquired for the road construction, you can see that, most of the land that was acquired, was between sea level and 120 metres above sea level. So we're not talking about extremes of landscape here, but what you are noticing then in terms of the frequency of archaeological sites, you have archaeological sites underrepresented in kind of the middle altitudes, and then at the slightly higher altitude, archaeological sites seem to be overrepresented. And again, this ties in with our existing knowledge in a way, because, for instance, if we look at the distribution of ring forts, so that, most typical early medieval form of settlement in Ireland, we know that in this part of Wexford, and research that Isabel Bennett has done indicates that the ring forts are being constructed on the higher, slightly higher elevations, and these are the elevations that are avoided by the road scheme in this case. So we didn't find any ring forts, thankfully, on the road scheme. We did find some evidence of early medieval settlement, but not substantial settlements. Broadening out the focus then to the southeast region as a whole, and the map on the left just maps all the known sites listed in the sites and monuments record, which amount to just under 22,000 sites in Wexford, Waterford, Kilkenny, Carlow, and what used to be known as South Tipperary. What's very striking when you look at the distribution of the types of monuments is that, more than half of the monuments represented in the Sites Monument Record relate to the historic period, and only 15% can clearly be seen to be, or can clearly be dated to the prehistoric period. So there's a disparity in terms of the preservation of monuments in the landscape. Later, generally more substantial, more durable monuments survive better than the earlier prehistoric monuments, which were more likely made or built of organic material and so on. And I suppose that this slide just kind of summarizes that in a visual way. You can see here the duration of human settlement in the southeast. The prehistoric era represents a huge majority of the time that people have been living in these landscapes. The historic era proportionately less. If you translate, the 9 millennia of human settlement in the southeast into 12 months of the year, basically the prehistoric period comes up until the end of October, Halloween, and the historic era is only, November and December. However, when you look at the monuments that survive, the historic era dominates. And, there's a wide range of factors as to why that is. And I suppose then the difference, or as I see it, the contribution that road and other types of development make, and the archaeological investigation of roads and other types of development make, it is through those types of developments that we're more likely to find the prehistoric period sites, but also sites like that peasant settlement at landscape, which weren't the residences of the great and the good and the mighty and the powerful, that were just people scraping by, the regular people who made up the majority of the population, but who don't feature, even though this is a historic era, they don't feature in the records, or if they do feature, it's only obliquely. So, on that point, I will say thank you. And there is the Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy Bridge, and I suppose it's worth thinking that future historical and archaeological research will undoubtedly tell us more about the sites that have been investigated and excavated as part of the New Ross bypass. Future development in this area will undoubtedly lead to the discovery of other new sites, which will also contribute. But it's worth thinking, of course, in the long term, future generations may well look at the Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy Bridge and the bypass and consider it to be significant parts of our collective heritage worthy of research and protection. So thank you very much.